Well, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Heather Himmelberger, Director at the Southwest Environmental Finance Center.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for getting on our webinar today. You can see the map that's up there that kind of just displays the different places where people are signing in today, just to give you an idea of who's all participating. I wanted to remind everybody that this is part of our project from EPA on the Smart Management for Small Water Systems that the Environmental Finance Center Network has been doing for EPA for the last 18 months. This is actually the last month of that project, and pretty soon we'll be kicking off round 2 of the project. So we'll be delivering some more in-person and webinar trainings coming up soon as part of our round 2 project. Under this project, we provided training in 6 different topic areas: asset management, rates and finance, access to multiple funding sources, regional cooperation, energy efficiency, and water loss. Today's webinar is part of the asset management activity under that project, and it's going to be a little bit different than the webinars that we did before. We had done 5 different webinars on asset management, and you can access those past webinars under our efcnetwork.org. If you go under past trainings, you will find 5 different webinars about asset management, and you're welcome to listen to any of those. This is going to be a little bit different. This is going to be an opportunity to ask questions and receive answers about asset management, so it'll be a lot less formal than our traditional webinars. And the way to make this webinar as useful to you as possible is to please provide us questions, things that are on your mind about asset management. So during the webinar, please feel free to type in any questions that you have about asset management or are interested in, and we'll be answering as many of those as we can throughout the webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce Ross Waugh. We have a very unique opportunity that I really wanted to take advantage of, where Ross is visiting the United States as part of a conference on road networks down in Miami, and we rerouted him to New Mexico to help us with some asset management stuff and share his expertise. And so we've been able to put him on this webinar to be able to ask you or answer some of your questions. And the great thing about Ross is that even though he's one of the premier asset management folks in New Zealand, and I think probably one of the best in the whole country of New Zealand, the greatest thing is he can bring it down to a level that is really effective for anybody. So it's not a lot of stuff that's at a high technical expertise level that nobody can understand. So Ross is really able to bring it down to simple terms, and that's one of the things we'll be talking about today probably is it's really important to keep asset management simple and easy to do. So Ross, if you want to say a few words in introduction, that would be great.
And you who are listening, I said to Heather a while ago, look, I'm going to this conference in Miami, which is next week, TRB, and she said, look, it's Albuquerque's on the way to Miami. I said, well, okay, yeah, that seems fair from New Zealand, so drew a line on the map. So here I am. So it's very nice to be here, and over in New Zealand at the moment, it's just the start of winter. It got pretty cold, and here in New Mexico, it's the start of, well, it's a bit past spring, and it's getting into early summer, and it's very pleasant. So I've been enjoying the nice warmth of New Mexico compared with a cold New Zealand winter.
Exactly. So as a beginning, we're just going to do a couple of questions just to get things started. And again, please submit your own questions. But one of the things I thought we would start with is just to have Ross maybe talk a little bit about the benefits they've seen in New Zealand from having done asset management for about 18 years now or so. They've been in the practice of asset management at their municipal level and their public works. And I thought it'd be good to just have him maybe talk a little bit about what they've seen in terms of benefits from having done this process.
Well, thank you, Heather. And the slide that Heather's just put up we'll get to in a few minutes. That slide came out of a study a couple of years ago. But just a bit of background for you. New Zealand had a really large recession from 1988 through to about 1993. It's 5 years, and it was pretty vicious. We had 12% true unemployment, and mortgage interest rates got up to over 20%, and a lot of unemployment, a lot of problems. And during that period, we just spent nothing on our infrastructure. It was just bare minimum maintenance, no capital work, new funding at all, no big economic adjustments going on, and no asset renewal going on. So at the end of that period, our chief auditor, our auditor general, had a look at what was going on and got very concerned about the fact that we had a whole heap of undeclared liabilities around municipal infrastructure, just because there'd been a long time since any reasonable money had been spent. So he produced a report to the government, our government, in 1995, and as a result, in 1996, asset management and 10-year financial forward forecasts for municipal and road authorities became mandatory. So since 1996, right through to now, 18 years, we've been doing asset management. Our political cycle is 3 years, not 4 years, so in our asset management, updating matches the political cycle. So we've had, in theory, we've had 6 cycles. The reality is the ball got dropped in the early 2000s, and so we've had about 5 cycles of asset management, updating, and renewal planning. And because it's mandatory, everybody had to do it. We've had a lot of benefits from that. The first of which was everybody had to get a decent inventory. And that took a time for authorities. A lot of people had quite poor records. Other people or other authorities had very good records. But it was also during a period where GIS was coming on stream and asset information system databases were coming on stream. So a lot of people took the opportunity to take their paper records and digitize them into GISs. So prior to that, in utilities, we'd had block sheets primarily, and maybe contract records we would put in facilities and pump stations and things like that. So we ended up with reasonably good inventories. We had a fairly good handle on what we had. We had to value them as part of our mandatory requirements. So we had that was typically based on replacement costs. So we had a depreciated replacement cost valuations, and so we knew what we had when we'd built it. And a lot of municipal authorities look after water in New Zealand. There's only 2 or 3 water authorities that are distinct from municipal authorities, but everybody had break records. So we typically had records of breaks, records of repairs, records of complaints, and they all ended up in systems and then ended up getting publicly reported. And our government, central government authorities, effectively the same as your federal authorities, were then able to aggregate all that information and produce an overview picture of what was happening in the whole country. What that did initially was just get all the information on the table and found out and the Auditor General had been right. In many cases, there were significant backlogs of asset renewals and maintenance even. And it also kicked off a very large debate in our community, which is still going on to some extent, around the affordability of assets and just what people were prepared to pay for. And as you all know, everybody wants their water and wastewater for free at the highest possible standard with no disruption at all ever. And if anything, they want it less than free. You know, if you could pay them for taking the water, they'd be even happier. So that's not distinct to the US. That's New Zealand as well. And so and the second thing is, all of our communities want somebody else to pay for their services. So they want our central government or your equivalent of federal government to pay for everything. So, and there's a reason. There's a bit of history for that. Back in the 1950s and 60s, New Zealand had a very big economic boom. And a lot of our utilities, water and wastewater utilities in our smaller towns and cities were put in at that time with co-funding from the government, sometimes 60-70%, but always 50%. So with the renewals that we've got going on at the moment, it's the first time that communities have actually ever paid the whole amount of the cost of the asset replacement. So we've had this debate. It would be fair to say ultimately that communities have come to see that they do need the services, and the governing bodies, in our case municipal councils, have been able to go out politically and say, look, we didn't spend a lot of money for 20 years, we now need to spend some money, and so the rates and the tariffs have been going up. But it's an ongoing tension and struggle, and I don't see that stopping anytime soon. So that's a bit of the background here.
Okay. One of the things that Ross and I have talked about when he's here is it's kind of important for people to understand the connections between what kind of service you're going to provide somebody, what level of funding they're going to get, and what kind of risk they might take on from that, and how all of those things fit together. So I think Ross and his colleagues have come up with a really good way of representing this, and that's kind of the picture that you see on the screen. And Ross, if you could talk a little bit about the diagram that's on the screen and how these three factors fit together, that would be great.
Right. So this diagram, when the recession hit the US, it hit the rest of the OECD as well. And New Zealand has had recession from 2007 to about 2012. We came out of it a couple of years ago, and this was obviously puts pressure on funding on infrastructure. And particularly in our land transport sector, it's all co-funded by the central government via fuel taxes. So 2 years ago, the minister in charge of that area, so your equivalent of cabinet secretary, I guess, created a task force to look at funding of road maintenance. And we got the job of, myself and some colleagues got the job of looking at all the road controlling authorities in New Zealand, equivalent of state DOTs, I guess, and looking at what they were doing and the asset management and the implications of that. So it was quite a wide-ranging study. We had to send out questionnaires to everybody, analyse the results, follow up on that, and then comment on the trends. And one of the things that came out was this diagram that you're looking at, and it applies to utilities as well. And it was simply that we'd had about a decade of increased funding in New Zealand and in the road area, also in utilities, and the levels of service had actually come up. And so this diagram is like the playground apparatus with the spring and the balance board. And typically what happens with that is if you push down on one area, the other two come up. So what had happened in New Zealand, we'd been funding more, and the levels of service had come up, and we felt that the risks of failure and risks of non-service delivery and things like that had gone down. So looking at the diagram, levels of service and funding had come up and risk had gone down. What's happening at the moment, and what was happening 2 years ago, was that the funding was becoming constrained and getting pushed down. And the feeling ultimately was, we've got some big levels of service reviews going on in land transport as well, around standardising and trying to, I think, stop over-delivery. So the feeling was, you're going to push the funding down for long enough, ultimately levels of service must push down, though it will probably take 5 years before that's noticeable, and risk will push up. And I think the same thing happens in utilities as well. The issue that we've got, and this thinking came out 2 years ago, and we've only just started trying to model the dynamics of this system, is that nobody knows quite how the relationships work. And it's very difficult to model because there's an awful lot of parameters in there. So one of our really large transportation networks has started doing some work on modeling this based on their own data and seeing what happens. But we've got a long way to go yet. But the reason I talked to Heather about it and we wanted to share it to you today is that conceptually, that is what happens. If you push funding down, ultimately levels of service have to drop, and risks across non-delivery of service or risks of increased failures will increase. And it's useful to understand that conceptually. However, just be aware that nobody knows what the answer to the break points or the trade-offs are in any sort of definitive way at the moment.
Great. Dawn, I'll just check in with you before we continue. Have any questions come in from our audience yet? If not, we'll keep going, but if so, we'll take some questions.
Yes, we do have some. The first question is, I have heard many different opinions about the most important very first step to take to get started with asset management. In your opinion, what is the most important very first step that should be taken?
Go ahead, Ross.
Do we want to jump forward to that slide with the rugby players?
Okay.
Go back one.
There we go.
So this slide here, and some of you might recognise the team there. one of the learnings we've certainly had in New Zealand over the past 18 years is that you really need to do the basics of asset management well. And those basics are having an asset register, asset inventory, and keeping it in good condition and in good records as best you can. The second thing is having a range of condition assessments that are realistic. And the third thing is getting your asset maintenance programs well sorted out. And if you only do those three things and you do nothing else, those are really important first steps. I think it's impossible to do good asset management without a good asset register. So there's a bit of work in getting that. And the reason the picture of the football players is it's like any game of football. If you don't do your basics well, then the other side are going to beat you right down the paddock. And so it's good football teams do the basics very, very well, and then they do the fancy stuff on top of that. If you can't get your ball back to the quarterback, then you're never going to win a game. So it's that sort of thinking, and so I think asset registers are really important.
And you know, one way to get started in the asset register is, of course, mapping. Many people, because we have a lot of field assets, you know, the pipe, the tanks, the hydrants, the valves, the meters, those types of things that are in the field. If you can map your system, that's a good way to get started in the asset register or the asset inventory process, because then you can start also getting locations of assets, and it can help you kind of, you know, put those assets into some kind of spreadsheet, database, program, whatever you want to use. So that's another thing to think about is, you know, using a map to help you with the asset register, and pictures. You know, taking pictures is another good way to get started with the asset register. Many systems have found that to really shorten the process of developing an inventory if they can go out and take pictures of at least what they can see. I mean, you can't see all your assets, but if you can see it, that can help you with getting the asset information in the register, and even in the condition assessment to some extent that can help you. So as you're getting started, you know, two ways to maybe start the asset inventory process would be, you know, maybe some mapping and some picture taking.
Yeah, one of the things we've found, Heather, I'm sure that you've had the same instance here, is that sometimes people just get involved in far too much detail with their asset register building, and they just try to do the 100% high level of detail and get bogged down, and then don't have the human resources or the contract resources to do that, and never get it finished. In New Zealand, we had some notable cases like that where people maybe took 3 or 4 years and never got finished, and so I think it's if you can't do it in 6 months, you're not doing it right, even 3 months. But it's just if you haven't started, give it a hit, do it at a level of detail that allows you to finish in 3 to 6 months, and then that will form the basis of all the rest of your analysis around asset management.
Yeah, you don't need to collect information that you won't value. If you're not going to use the information for something, you don't need to collect it. And, you know, I think like Ross said, if you just get started in a level that you feel comfortable with, you can always add to it later. If you want to add some extra fields or extra information about an asset, you can always add to it later. But if you start down the path of collecting too much, like we knew one particular authority was going to put in about 45 different pieces of data about an asset, and it was just out of control. There was no way they can do it. And after about the first 5 assets, they realized that wasn't going to happen. So they regrouped and said, we really only need about maybe 6 to 10 pieces of information, depending on the asset. We're only going to collect that now, and if we need something later, we can go back and add it. So again, you don't need to make it so complicated that you can't get it done. It's really about collecting the information that you think will be valuable to you in your asset management program going forward, you know, the stuff that you have access to that feels comfortable, so that you don't get so bogged down you can never get anywhere past your inventory.
Yeah, look, and I started doing asset register builds back in the mid-90s, and a really good tip is to pick quite a small area of your utility, or if you've got a number of towns that you're looking after, one of the smaller towns. In my case, I had a town that was had 137, I can still remember the number, 137 sewer manholes or inspection holes, because the thing is you can put that into your asset register really quick, and then have a look at it and say, well, does that do what we want it to do? And if you don't like it, we actually had 4 goes at that before, because it was really, there were no manuals back in those days. It was really seat of your pants, try it out. But pick something small and do a pilot, and get your data capture and your data information levels at, everybody agrees that that's what we want, that's what we need, but if it's not right, you know, it's real quick to redo or to do over, and then apply it to your bigger areas once you've got that sorted out. And if you do the pilot, get everybody in agreement, then do the big areas. That works really well.
Yeah, we had one of the videos in our asset management manual is from Dover, New Hampshire, and the gentleman there started with his hydrants because he really wanted to get comfortable with the whole asset management, asset inventory process. So he did all of his hydrants because that was something he could see. He could go out and look at them. He could touch them. He could take a picture of them. And he did an inventory of his water hydrants as a starting point, got very comfortable with that, and then was able to move on. So, you know, like as Ross mentioned, if you pick maybe a subset of your assets and try it out, it can give you the confidence and the skills that you need to go further with some of the assets that might be a little more difficult because you can't see them or you don't know where they are. Dawn, do you have a next question?
Yes. And this is just clarification. By asset register, you're referring to an asset inventory, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And then a follow-up question to what we've been talking about, the good high-level basics, that makes sense. Thanks. When do you know you've got enough of these 3 before starting on the next?
Are you talking about, I guess they're mentioning when do you have enough of the register, condition assessment, and asset maintenance program? I'm assuming that's the question. You know, when do you have enough of that to go on to more?
Yeah, well, I think the thing is you'll know when you've got your asset inventory and or registered. It's just different terminology for the same thing.
Yeah, the Kiwis have to have their own words.
Yeah, we have funny words, but anyway, different from Australians too, just in case you're wondering. But yeah, you'll know when you've got that complete. The area that's a bit challenging in building an asset inventory is actually pump stations and treatment plants. Pipe inventory is actually not too bad because they're pretty distinct elements, and it's only just a matter of how you're grouping your hydrants and your valves and your T's and stuff like that more than anything. When you get into pump stations and or larger and more complex treatment plants, it's what level you're breaking it down to. And so you could start at a very high level, just describing your major process trains, but then you might want to get down to individual key elements within there, like pumps or motorized valves or screens or whatever it is that you've got there. So often you'll have two goes at the mechanical electrical treatment assets. I think you can get a first run through and then get on with other stuff, but you might want to go down to more detail later on depending on the analysis you're doing. With condition assessment, it's really interesting because obviously there's some assets like your civil works at a treatment plant or most treatment plants. You can go and have a look at everything and get a fairly good handle on what's happening. With pipes, and particularly water pipes, it's a lot harder. And what you end up having to do is using other things as a proxy for condition. So that starts being breakages or leakage, or you might have done, say, on some steel pipes, some specific testing or something like that. So it's just looking at what you've got and what you can get. With with condition assessment, you can end up spending a huge amount of money and not gaining very much extra knowledge. So it's having a bit of a filter on that. In terms of the maintenance program, the reason I put that there as a basic is that, well, in New Zealand we started out, what pushed our asset management around initially was renewals. We had big renewal backlogs for pipes mainly. And you forget that where do you spend most of your money? You actually spend an awful lot of money in asset maintenance and operations, and that's that. Like if you talk to accountants and they're looking out for fraud or anything like that, they'll always say follow the money. And in asset management, if you're wanting to make your biggest gains, where you're putting your biggest amounts of expenditure in, and then have a look at that and say, well, is there some things that we can do smarter? Can we optimize some of our preventative maintenance? A little example, a few years ago I was doing a a contract for quite a large utility in New Zealand, and they had wastewater pump stations. They had 120 odd of them, and they were inspecting them every day. And we said, well, yeah, that's a lot of inspections. Why are you inspecting the pump stations every day? And so we just asked that little why question, you know, like the 2-year-olds do. It's a really great question to ask when you're doing asset management. Why are we doing this? And it turned out that the whole reason that the daily inspections were there was because that's what they used to do 20 years ago. But 20 years ago was before they put SCADA or telemetry in, and they had a really good SCADA system. And so we said, well, do you really think you need to be doing daily inspections? And the answer was no. And so in that case, they decided in the end that they would go to weekly inspections, and they were looking for build-up of fats and making sure there was no blockages in the pumps and that it was clean and they're washing down the well and things like that. So there was still a really good reason for a weekly inspection, just to make sure they stayed on top of proper problems, preventative maintenance. I think they probably could have gone to 2 weekly or even monthly with the amount of SCADA they had telling them, but little steps. And the thing that happened was that they didn't lay those guys off that were doing the daily inspections. They then redeployed them to do some other things that hadn't been happening that they needed to do, but they were just being far more effective in terms of that part of their maintenance program. So I think that's why you do that. You'll know when you're at a level, and then you can start, or if you haven't already, you can be putting risk over the top of that and criticality analysis and starting to do a bit more asset analysis. But if you get the basics right, then you'll take care of a good lot of it.
Okay. Do you have more questions, Dawn?
Yes, we have plenty. What would you see as the best way that regulatory agencies can help communities develop asset management programs?
Okay, I think I'll take that one, and let Ross jump in as he wants, since we have a little bit different regulatory structure over here as over there. But certainly the systems need to be incentivized. Maybe we could talk a little bit about the moral hazard part.
I think we could start by talking about there's a little ratio that we've come up with in New Zealand, having been fully mandated, so people haven't had a choice. And what we've observed is that 15 to 20% of the municipalities said, "Great asset management. Where have you been in my life? Understand it. You know, really like it. Management and governance have seen the benefits, and they just jump in and get on with it and do it very, very well." Somewhere between 60 and 70% go, "Yep, we know we've got to do this," and they do a pretty honest attempt at it. They're not going to lead the way. They're not leading the pack, but they just get on and do a good solid effort and stay with the programs and things like that. The problem that we have, and I think the problem that if you stop and think about it, most places will have, is that bottom 15%, and they're the ones that only pay lip service. Or they only, you know, if we've got to do this, we don't believe in it, we're just going to do the bare minimum of compliance. And they drag the chain, and they make mistakes, and they have all sorts of problems, and then whoever the regulator is feels the need to regulate to deal with that bottom 15%. The trouble is that you can never make the regulation just for them. So it ends up being the regulation for everybody. And so the bottom 15% of your industry or your area end up setting the regulatory framework. It's built like criminal law. You know, if there were no criminals, we wouldn't need a whole lot of laws. So it's the bottom that always sets the legislative or regulatory framework, and it's something to think about. Heather and I were actually talking about that the other night, and we said, hey, that's the same with people that yell and scream about tariffs as well, you know, or changes in rates. It's as an aside, you never hear from 85 or 90% of the people. They just, oh yeah, well, if you need that to run your utility, you need that. It's that bottom 5 or even 1% that jump up and down and make a lot of noise, and then everything changes because of them. And it's a really interesting thought when you think of it in that way. But so, coming back to the regulatory thing, I think it's being aware of that dynamic and being aware that there is going to be a 15 to 20% of authorities or municipalities or water districts or whatever who are going to struggle, and what do you do to assist them?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that hopefully we can eventually address in the United States. I think one of our biggest dilemmas is the way that we fund water systems. A lot of times the funding is going to the worst entities instead of the best entities, and there's a disincentive sometimes to do something like asset management because the worst systems are getting the funding faster and sooner than the better run systems. So then they see, why am I doing all this if somebody else who's run worse than I am is getting all the money? That's one issue. So that we have that sort of the moral hazard issue where we're trying to do the right thing by improving public health, but we have the opposite side of trying to say, well, if you're not running your assets properly, you're actually getting more funding. But the more important component that we have is actually the idea that our funding agencies only fund capital projects. They don't fund what they consider to be operation and maintenance. So sometimes a more efficient operation for an entity would be to do more maintenance, do more, maybe interventional maintenance to put off a capital project, but when they go to get funding, the capital project is going to be funded, and what they had wanted to do couldn't be funded because it's more of a maintenance kind of dynamic. And eventually we have to come to grips with that, of being able to fund the efficient operation as opposed to, you fund O&M out of your customer revenues and you get funding from the federal or state government to fund capital projects, and that can really be a problem with asset management.
And Heather, I was just wondering if we can go to that slide with the worst first slide. This is something that we've found over the last 18 years in New Zealand, is that you've got to be really, really careful about the behaviour you incentivise. If you're putting a contract out, just a straight maintenance or construction contract, if you write it in such a way to incentivise a certain amount of behaviour or punish a different behaviour, that will alter the way that contract goes. And in terms of regulators or funders of utilities, if you incentivise worst first behaviour, which is just letting the system, so what that is letting the system degrade to a level where you've got a heap of problems, a lot of breaks or a lot of overflows, and then you chuck a whole lot of money at it because that's a problem that's on the front page of the paper every day. That is like fighting a wildfire. It's just firefighting. It feels good at a certain level, but it's just it can cost 3 or 4 times as much as an optimized running a system in an optimized way. So you're wasting money that you could have otherwise used in other places. But the trouble is, there's this moral hazard, because if you reward that poor behaviour, everybody else notices, and so the people that are running their systems well then have to run an argument that says, well, hey, their governments might say, well, why don't we just let our system run down like the next door neighbours have, and we'll get all this federal money, all this regulator money, because why are we doing the job properly? And it's a really valid question. So the thing that we've mostly managed to avoid encouraging that sort of behaviour in New Zealand. Every now and again it gets close. But it is important to reward good management and good behaviour and good asset management. And for towns and authorities that let their assets fall to bits, make them pay for it. One way or the other, do not reward that poor behaviour, because otherwise everybody gets the message.
Okay, Don, do you have more questions for us?
Yes. In a small system with a small staff that is learning, can we deploy an asset management program ourselves with cups, or are we going to need to hire a professional to complete the job?
This is one of my favorite questions. Not necessarily specifically about cups, but rather whether you need to have a professional or not. And I would say my response is that having the plan at the level that you yourselves can implement is better than having a plan that's way above that level that somebody else did for you. I absolutely believe that you can do much of it yourself. Maybe you need a little help now and again from an outsider to help you with a specific thing, but you can do as much as possible yourselves, and you will gain a lot from having looked at your assets yourself and instead of having somebody else look at them. You will gain a lot by going through thinking process, because you really want the understanding of asset management to reside in your organization and not somebody else. In fact, we had a meeting yesterday, an asset user group meeting here in New Mexico, and one of the comments that came up is that communities that use engineers a lot to do various things, you know, design and build and that type of thing, the engineers have tons of information about the systems, but the systems don't have it. And that's a real problem, because the communities themselves, the water systems, need that information. If there's mapping or condition information or manufacturer information, the communities need that information. So if you hire somebody to come in and do it for you, much of that knowledge will not reside with your staff, but will reside with others, and you won't get all the benefits from that. So you really want to make sure you take advantage of what's, you know, your own staff and your own kind of building your own thinking process around asset management. And that may mean you can't have a fancy map. Maybe your map is a lot more simple, or maybe you have a more simple asset inventory. Maybe use an Excel spreadsheet or something else that helps you put that in. And maybe if you'd hired an outsider, they're going to come up with a fancier database, but you're better off to have your spreadsheet that you know how to use as opposed to a database that maybe you're not comfortable with. So I do believe that you can do a lot of it yourself.
Yeah, and look, the thing that Heather was saying around your consulting engineers or outside engineers holding all the information, we've been through that loop several times in New Zealand, and now we've had some particularly nasty examples of large, and in our case it was large but didn't necessarily be, consulting firms who had outsourced all of the engineering design and management and asset management to them. The cost just got too high for the community. They then wanted to reacquire the information and paid again, basically. And so we're a small country. There's only 4 million people there, and the word got out pretty quick. And pretty much now every municipality and water authority in New Zealand holds its own information. They don't. Every contract that's let, the information has to come back. There's no all the firms, if they want, the outside consulting firms, if they want to do the job, they've got to return the information. They don't get the job if they want to hang on to it. And so, because it's applied across the board, there's no competitive disadvantage to anybody in that environment. So it's sorted it out. And now we're getting to a situation where we've got regional mapping services showing all the utilities and things like that. And so, because all the information's in a publicly available space for each utility, it's working really well. The other thing, and I'd just like to make perhaps a little comment about asset information systems. My little bit of my background there is that is one of my consulting strength areas, and such that the International Infrastructure Management Manual was reviewed in 2011. I got the job of rewriting that section of the manual for the whole of Australasia. So my peers across Australasia recognise that I'm as good as anybody in that field. And for a small authority, an Excel spreadsheet is fine. The reason I'm saying this is there's a lot of systems vendors out there, and they'll come and sell you. And there's some very good systems. We're using a lot of them in New Zealand, and I know of a lot that get used in Australia. But it's horses for courses. You get what you need to do the job that you need to do. And if you're quite a small authority, you've only got half a dozen or a dozen staff, you're not going to have the staff overhead to support a big asset information system. And the other myth, and we still run into it in New Zealand, this is 18 years down the track, is, oh, I will buy some software and it will do my asset management for me. And it's the biggest myth that's out there, because asset management's not about software, it's about business processes, it's about thinking your way through how you manage your assets. And software is only a tool to help you do that. It won't do your thinking for you. And so I support what Heather was saying, is that the best result is to go and get the information yourself, find out and have a look at your own assets and see what's going on with them, and then do your own thinking about what do I need to change in terms of maintenance, or what do I need to change in terms of my replacement program, or hey, if I'm only funding 50% of the work that's needed for the next 10 years, let's go and tell some people about that and start the debate now at our governments or our board or our community. Because if you leave it, it's just going to cost you 3 times or 4 times as much anyway. So.
Okay. Next question, Don.
And on that same note, what is the most user-friendly software we can use?
I'm not going to even give you an answer for that. I think the thing is that in the International Infrastructure Manual, what I did was I had I know this is in there because I wrote it, and it's public information if you bought the manual, the 2011 version. The user-friendly software is actually the wrong question. The question should be, what outputs do I need from my system? And once you sort out what it is you need out of any piece of software, so what questions do I need to answer, then that presupposes a whole lot. There's 4 other questions. You need to involve your governance and your management of your organization and say, well, do you agree with the outputs that we've come up with? Get that political and management agreement that, hey, we need to answer these questions, or we need, if it's a regulatory requirement or a state reporting or a federal reporting requirement, whatever it is, get a list of the outputs that you need. Once everybody's agreed on that, then you need to sit down and say, well, what inputs do I need to answer those outputs? Because there's absolutely no problem, or there's no point in collecting information that you're never going to use. And that's what we did in New Zealand. Now, back in the 90s, we implemented quite big asset systems, and they had all these fields that you could fill in. So we thought, oh, well, we'd better go and fill in all these fields. And so we went and spent 5 years collecting lots and lots of inventory and filling in fields. And then for a lot of them, we said, once you got to the point to analyze stuff, you went, oh, never going to use that. Oh, what did we collect that for? And of course, once you start collecting stuff, you then feel the need to maintain the information as well. So what outputs do I need? What inputs do I need to get those outputs? The third part of it, and I've got agreement and sign off from my management, senior management, and also my governance, because I'm going to have to pay for this, and it's software plus time, somebody's time, either yours or external consulting resources. Then what are my business processes? Because if your business processes aren't in place to support turning inputs through software to outputs, then you'll just won't get the right result. And so that's business processes around data collection, business processes around quality assurance, business processes around updating of data, and a whole heap of other things like that. Now, when you've got all that lined up, then go look for some software. And the thing is, you'll know what the answer is at that point too, because you'll have a fairly good idea of what it is you want and how much you want to use it and how you want to need to use it. And there's a lot of really good packages out there. So that's all I can say on that.
And I think it's also a hard question to answer, because what's user-friendly to one is not necessarily user-friendly to another. So there's not like one right answer of what's user-friendly, because somebody understands a database better than a spreadsheet, somebody else understands a spreadsheet better than a database, somebody else just wants to use a piece of paper because that's what they understand. Yeah. So it's really a matter of, a lot of it is personal, what you know and what you feel comfortable with. And I think, Ross is absolutely right that I have actually worked with quite a few folks over the years who right away jumped to buying the software. Maybe they've been at a conference and they've heard about it. Maybe their neighbor has that software. Maybe they, like the name or who knows what, but they right away will jump to buying a software and investing in that software. And then they don't go back until much later to say, well, what did we actually want it to do? And then find out that the software doesn't actually meet the needs they really wanted to do. Or maybe it's way above what they needed, and they spent a lot of extra money on a software that maybe they needed something much simpler. So I think it's really important, as Ross said, to do the thinking part first. What do you want the software to actually do for you? What are you going to use it for? And then go seek something, and you'll be able to tell if what you're looking at matches what it is you want it to do. And then that way you can get much closer to what you actually need instead of, buying the software first. Because I think, the myth that Ross mentioned of how people equate software to asset management is part of that. That if you think, oh, I have to do asset management right away, you want to go buy something. And that's really not it. It's really about the thinking part that goes behind it. And the software is just a tool to help you do that thinking or that analyzing. It's not the same as asset management.
Yeah, and look, we've got, and being a small country, we've got a lot of very small authorities, and what we've observed with them was that we had national purchasing of software that was organised, and we got great discounts, and it was aimed around the mid to large-sized authorities, and it worked really, really well for them. But with the small guys, they just couldn't support the software. It was too complex, or it was just too much overhead for them. And so what we've learned from that over, that took us 15 years to learn that, and they just slowly drifted away from the larger system simply because they tried and couldn't support it, or couldn't hold the staff that knew about it, or whatever it was. And I think if you're going to buy any software, you've got to be very clear about the arrangement. If you're buying a bureau and somebody else is doing all of that, then get the costs all sorted and do it that way if you want to. But you'll find that the costs will be quite a bit more than you initially think. If you're trying to get somebody else to do all your thinking for you, well, then that's a problem in itself, because you're actually not going to ask the right questions in the first place. So you're going to get the wrong answers to the wrong questions and pay quite a lot for that. But if you've got software that even if you're buying it off the web as a software as a service or whatever, but you're going to be using it as an in-house resource and doing that, and that's quite a good result, be it in-house software or web purchase, you've got to buy it at a level that you can support it and sustain it long term, because there's absolutely no use having only one person in an organization that knows how to use something. And then they go, and where are you? Or one person has built a black box themselves, and then they go, and how does anybody else use it? And so it's what we found with our smaller authorities is they came down to some little GIS map info level type base systems that they generally had map info for their regulatory planning and stuff like that. So they had in-house resources that knew how to use map info, and it was widely used across the organisation. It worked really well for them, but that's just New Zealand. The key message there was simply make sure that whatever you buy you can sustainably support as an agency or an authority over a longer period of time, because otherwise you're just going to waste your money. So.
Okay, Dawn?
I've seen many guides to asset management, many of which are very similar to others. Is there one guide, internationally or nationally, that is usually seen as the model for asset management? And if not, what are 2 or 3 of the most commonly used guides domestically and internationally, particularly for small systems?
Well, I guess it's a shameless plug, but the Environmental Finance Center, our center wrote the AM Can Work, and that was meant to be for smaller to mid-sized utilities. Anybody can really use it, but it was geared more for smaller to medium-sized utilities, and we were trying to be offering different possibilities for different size utilities, and the whole thought behind the manual was that it was more focused on the thinking part and not a prescriptive, fill in the blanks and you'll have a plan. It was more guiding people through the thought processes. We do have that manual available to anybody who wants it for free. We were very lucky that the state of Kansas, who paid for its development, agreed to allow us to make it available. That was very generous of them to do so. So we can send you a link to that manual after this webinar, and you can access it online. Again, so that was something nationally that's used, and I know there are a lot of different places using the manual. New Mexico is using it as sort of a guide to how asset management is going to be done here. Kansas, of course, is using it. Many other states are, but it is not Kansas specific. It's very generic for anybody who is doing asset management. It kind of just helps you, and there's also a lot of videos from other organizations who are doing asset management, and actually Ross is featured in a couple of the videos when he was here before we filmed him. So there's a lot of good information in there. So on the national side, that's one I can mention. That is a guide for environmental or asset management, and then Ross can speak on the international side.
Well, I could. I mean, I obviously have had a look at the guide, the Kansas one that Head has written. I think it's a really good guide for small systems, and there's some very clear and easy to use guidance sheets and stuff in the back of it that if you started with that, you'd go a long way down the track. Out of Australasia, there's the International Infrastructure Management Manual, which is more of a toolkit, so it has a whole heap of discussion and ideas and case studies around different tools for the different components of asset management. That's a very, very good overall guide. there's in both in Australia and New Zealand, we've got practice guides across a range of and subsidiary guides, but they tend to be a little bit more specific to the practice that we have over there. Just in February, there's the ISO 55000 series of standards that have come out for asset management. They're not going to tell you how to write an asset plan or do your asset management, though. If you know ISO 9000 or 14000, they're management standards, and the 55000 is along the same vein. So they're quite high level, and they set a framework as opposed to a lot of specifics. And they have a whole long, I think there's like 70 or 80 you shall type statements in there. So if you're doing asset management, you shall do this, this, and this. But if you do like using international standards, that's just out, and it's going to be quite useful, I think. Particularly for larger authorities where with ISO, of course, you can get accredited assessment that says you meet the standard. Big process, costs a lot of money, more suitable to quite large utilities. But I think in Australasia, particularly, our larger utilities will probably go down that track, just because they've already got ISO 9000 and 14000 type certification, and it's part of their business process and practice for a large organisation. A lot more formalised, documented system, a lot of quality assurance and stuff like that. I don't know that it's particularly appropriate for smaller systems, but it's just to be aware that's out there. You may have heard of PAS 55, which is a UK standard. Well, that was the precursor to ISO 55000. So if you know about PAS 55, then that's become superseded in the last few months. That would be the main ones, but I think, to be honest, start with the Kansas one via the environmental finance. It's a pretty good set of tools and guidelines to get you started.
Okay, Don?
Can I hear some examples of systems defining level of service with their communities? It seems a great collaboration in theory, but not necessarily easy to do in practice, no?
I would say that's probably true, that it is a little bit harder to do in practice than in theory, because you do have to go out and seek your customer input, and that's not always easy to do, because as Ross mentioned when we kind of talked about the 15% at the top, the 70% in the middle, and the 15% at the bottom, you know, who are the customers you typically hear from? Your 15% at the bottom who are complaining about, you know, whatever, and then you don't want to base all your level of service standards on those people who are complaining. You want to have an across the board, you know, what do my customers really want? So I think there are some difficulties in getting that customer input when you're first setting your level of standards, but I'd like Ross, if you can comment on how maybe New Zealand has done gathering of customer data, or how they handle that piece.
Yeah, and I think the thing is you've got to go back to setting service level standards to start with, because every utility authority in the world already has a set of service level standards that have been worked out over a long period of time, as long as they've been in business, based on what people wanted. It's just you haven't called them levels of service and you haven't documented them. But a really simple example is if your community wants a fast response to breaks, and so maybe you've got your response of a crew on site down to an hour or even half an hour, depending on what people have been prepared to pay for, and that's been the norm in your community or your water authority. That's a service level. You know, our service level is our response to site is half an hour or an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours, whatever it is, based on your circumstances. That's nothing new, you know, like that's something you've worked out over a long period of time. Maybe you've got some other service levels set by permits or things like that. So the first thing that you need to do when you're sorting out service levels is sit down and try and write down what you've got now. What am I doing right now? That's where we started, because back in New Zealand was, we know we do all this stuff, but how do we turn that into service level speak? And so we sat down and wrote those down, and it was things like pressure, and it was things like response to customers, and time on site, and the longest period of an outage that we'd want. And if we had a planned shutdown, you know, you'd have a service level around notifying people publicly and stuff like that. Or if it's an unplanned shutdown that you were supposed to try and notify down the street with a loud hailer or something like that before you did it. And those are all service levels. even the cost per year or per month or whatever it is, or per unit of water that you're metering that's a service level. So when we first did it, what we didn't realise is that there's sort of like two levels of service levels. There's the customer ones, the ones that the customers care about, and then there's a whole heap of technical ones. So, for instance, the customer doesn't want to know that there's so many pounds per square inch pressure. They just want to know they turn on the tap and it runs and they hop under the shower and they get a reasonable flow of water. So a customer service level in that instance is, I want a reasonable flow of water at a reasonable pressure. That's sort of a generic statement. At the technical level, you're just going to say, well, we're going to supply so many pounds per square inch of pressure at so much volume per customer line or something like that. So it's a lot more technical measure. And you could go and check that by putting a pressure gauge on a service line into a house, or checking at a tap or something like that. Or you could express it, I need to fill a 10-gallon bucket in however many seconds, or whatever, however you want to express it. So what we didn't realise when we first got into it was that you do have customer service levels. You know, the potability of water, you'll have a whole heap of standards, EPA standards and state and even local standards maybe around what is potable water. The customer doesn't actually care about that. They just want water that's safe to drink. And so, you know, a customer service level is, our water is safe to drink. But technically that means a whole lot of stuff that nobody really cares about apart from water professionals and regulators. So when you're doing your service levels, have a go at the customer ones, because they're the ones you need to consult on. And there might only be, like, typically we would have 5 to 7 in New Zealand now. We've had way more than that with the custom ones, but we've you know, you get, when you've had 6 goes at it, you get better every time. So those are the ones that you consult on, and then the technical ones are the ones that are set often by permit or by regulation or by industry practice, and those are the ones you measure internally that tell you that you're meeting the custom one, and you link them up, and away you go.
Great. Don?
Okay, this is kind of a two-part question, and I'll read through the whole thing. We have one part-time operator who is also the GM and the secretary. How often does the inventory, the condition, and the asset management plan need to be updated? In your experience, could this reasonably be the responsibility of our all-volunteer board?
I think in that circumstance, once you've built the original inventory, the thing is that in very small systems, unless you're replacing some assets, in which case you'll know about it, or you're adding a new area, things don't change that much or that quickly. So bigger authorities, you've always got stuff going on because there's always renewals or development going on or whatever, bigger cities and towns. But in a very small system, if it's stable, once you built your inventory, maybe you're only going to just do a check once a year and just go, hey, was there anything that changed? The things that catch you are like if you swapped out a pump and put a new pump in or something like that, you might want to update it. But the people would know. It's not something you're going to sit down in that case and do every month or every week. Whereas my recommendation for a larger or mid to larger size utility is that you do your additions and deletions monthly, because then you nail the process and you stay on top of it. We've had terrible problems in New Zealand with people leaving it a year to 3 years, and then everybody forgets what happened, and you know, it takes a long time to scramble around and find all the capital works projects and make sure you've got them all, and all the renewal projects and any of the you know, mechanical large maintenance where you've swapped pumps out or screens out or whatever. So it is where you've got a bit more of a dedicated team. I think monthly is the ideal. If you're doing something every month, you have to nail the process, and once you've done that, then it'll flow quite smoothly. With a very small, very stable system, inventory, asset register, condition. A condition could even be once every sort of 3 to 5 years. The inventory or the asset register, maybe just do a check once a year to say, hey, what's changed, and stay on top of it.
Yeah, and I think the second part of the question was, you know, could the volunteer board kind of work on this? And I think once you've got the process in place, again, looking at it as a very small utility that maybe not a lot is changing, you know, it might not be so burdensome for your volunteers. it would still, in my opinion, be better for them to do it than for you to consult out each year to have somebody come in and do it for you. Even if you have to do it a very simple way, or maybe it takes you a little bit more time, maybe it's a year and a half instead of a year to get it all done. Having your own eyes on your assets and kind of having your own involvement in the process is a really good way to learn about your system. You know, some of the folks who went and did inventories and did condition assessments learned a lot about their system that they didn't really know. You know, assets that were kind of in worse shape than they realized, you know, maintenance that hadn't been done, tasks that have been put off because nobody really stopped and kind of took a look at the assets and kind of took that bigger step back. So you, I think you can do it with your volunteers. You may just have to set the time horizon that fits best with the people that you have and the time availability. But if you look at maybe a year to a year and a half, if you're a smaller utility, and try to, you know, do it in little pieces over time, you know, I think you can do it with your staff.
Yeah, I think a small system like that's most likely just to have an Excel spreadsheet as their inventory. So it's not going to be a big effort to change stuff. You'll know if you've replaced a pipeline or a pump, and you just go to that one and go, hey, well, that one's gone, and yeah, it was an old steel pipe, and now we've put in a plastic pipe, and it's 6 inch. It was 6 inch. You know, so it's a really quick exercise. You're not talking weeks of time to update those sorts of things. It's maybe going to be a couple of hours once a year, and you'd have it cleaned up. So.
Okay, Don?
I just wanted to add that we know that there are lots of systems out there that would be very grateful to have their board to be involved at that level. So I think it could be a very good thing. The next question, can you list the common outputs of an asset management program?
I wonder if they're talking about like the database, the outputs that we mentioned from the database. And I think, you know, you have to think about what is it you want to make decisions about, and that will help set your outputs, you know, for your process. You know, what kind of information do you need out of a process to make decisions that you need to make? And it would probably be, you know, very system specific of what you're trying to get at. So, Ross, if you want to talk more about the output side of things?
Well, I think to say the first thing I'd say is back 18 years ago, we had no idea what outputs we wanted. So we put a whole lot of stuff into databases, and it was all a bit new, and got to the end of that and said, oh, now what can we do with this? And even now, we're still, a couple of my staff work with systems all the time, and just getting people to go, what do you actually want out of, what question you're trying to answer is still a huge problem. So it's a good question, because it's a very hard question for people that are starting to answer. I think, as Heather says, it really depends on what's in your system and what sort of state it's in, and even what you've got to come back to what's driving you to do asset management, and what are you trying to, what questions you're trying to answer, and you start simple. So if you're concerned that you've got a lot of pipe that's pretty old and it's starting to break a lot, then the question you might want to answer is, well, how much do we need to spend each year to stay on top of this, and when do we think the big lumps in expenditure are going to be? And then the third question you might want to answer is, in that case, is, well, have we got the money? Have we got the governance, the board on side to pay for that? And so that will set you about collecting a certain amount of data. You're going to get an inventory of all your pipes to get the best, to your best knowledge of the material and the age of them, and to the best of your knowledge the condition of them. I've worked with other authorities who've had very, very new pipe, like it's only 20 or 30 years old, but a lot of little pumps because they were in quite sandy conditions, and their wastewater lift stations were only going down about 1.8 metres before they had to put a pump in. And in their case, they had over 100 pumps, all 25 years old, so all sort of getting towards the end of the life, and they had one guy who was that whole conversation started around, we'll call him Bob. He was the pump supervisor, and he had a little black book where he kept everything, and they'd spent a lot of effort putting their pipes into their inventory, and they hadn't got the pumps. I said, what, so Bob doesn't come to work tomorrow? They just said, we'd be gone. He's the only guy that knows everything about these pumps and where they're at. And so I said, well, if it was me, I'd stop working on the pipes, because your pipes are actually quite new and they're not in too much trouble. And I'd start getting everybody to get to know a lot more about these pumps, because, you know, Bob's a good guy, but he's also 55, and he's, you know, he's not going to be here. And New Zealand retirement age is 65 at the moment. So, you know, Bob was only ever going to be there for another 10 years. And so it really depends on what you've got going on, what your asset mix is, what the ages of them are, and just even what your local situation is. And then that'll start telling you what questions you need to answer, and then that'll start telling you where you need to go from there.
Okay, Don?
I have come to the end of my list.
Okay, well, we have a little bit of time, so I'll go back to some questions that we had thought of before the webinar. So we'll go back to some other things, and maybe some other questions will come up as we move along here. Now I'm trying to, oh, there we go. We'll talk a little bit.
Go back to the sawtooth, maybe.
Oh, okay. This is an interesting issue that has come up, and I think it's something that I have certainly experienced with utilities that I've been working with, and it was an issue that Ross brought to my attention about 3 years ago when he was here before, and I would love to say I wish Ross was wrong on this particular topic, but unfortunately he hasn't been. So Ross, if you can walk him through the idea of the sawtooth problem, I think it would really be helpful.
And this is a problem we've observed in New Zealand and certainly observed in Australia as well, and that is when an organisation starts down the track of asset management, there's usually, you know, people are keen to get going, and they go and get trained, and they get on with the work, and they bring the organisation up to a certain level of capability and capacity and understanding of asset management. And for many, many organisations in Australia and New Zealand, over a period of time, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years, that capacity drops off, and then it'll get picked up again. The management or senior engineers or whoever it is will realise, hey, we've fallen back here, and they give it another push, and up it comes again. And this is the sawtooth problem, and it simply around the fact that almost always asset management is driven by individuals, and it's very, very hard in the early days of it to embed that practice into the organisation. So the individual gives it, or 2 or 3 or 4 individuals in a big organisation, maybe a few more, but they give it a really good shove, and they get it up to a point, but it doesn't embed into the organisational culture, and it doesn't into their practices. And so what happens is when the impetus or those individuals leave, or they get into different roles, it just slides back to where it was, because the organisation as a whole hasn't bought into it. And so the thing is that that's not a failure of asset management. And some people would go, oh yeah, well, we got to a point, we dropped back, we failed. Well, no, that's just another observation on organisational dynamics, and that's just the reality of organisational change management. What we're finding in New Zealand now, and this is 18 years down the track, is younger engineers who 18 years ago were starting in asset management and doing that, they're now landing in very senior management positions, and they don't have any questions about it. It's just part of the way they do business. And so you're starting to get chief engineers and CEOs who just implicitly, this is, why aren't we doing this? You know, if they go into a new authority, get the promotion or a job or whatever. And so we're starting to see now that it's the sawtooth, the teeth dropbacks are decreasing a bit, I think. Certainly in the top 85% of authorities. The bottom 15% are still in that problem where they're just not committed to it. Their management and their boards aren't committed to it, regardless of the fact it's been law for 18 years. So you're talking about quite a long time where organisations can be quite resistant to change. So it's just something you probably will observe, because it's just a very simple part of organisational dynamics. Be aware of it. Be aware that the way to manage through it is to have commitment from the top to the bottom of the organisation, and it's like anything. You need to keep training people and keep encouraging them to think a bit differently the way they used to, and over time then this methodology of thinking and managing will just embed itself and become just part of the way you do business.
And I think, one other point is back to the question a couple of questions ago about getting their board members involved in the asset management process. And if more people can do that, I think it can help the sawtooth problem, because you see the people who are actually making decisions can get a handle on, you know, how asset management is helping the system and what it's doing for them. And, you know, the more those kinds of people really get bought into asset management, the more the organization will change in behavior to try to counteract the sawtooth problem and not get discouraged about what's going on. So I think if you can get your boards and your governing bodies more involved in the whole thing, you know, that will really help you embed it into the organization.
Yeah, one of the things that's taken probably 10 years in New Zealand and 3 election cycles, but one of the things that's been very, very helpful is when you get a new board or a council or governance body elected, is running a workshop or some training for them and taking them through how this stuff works and what the impacts are, and helping. I mean, they've been elected to make decisions on behalf of the community or the area being served, and generally they won't have a lot of knowledge about the intimate details of asset management. It's not something you run across if you're managing a business or you're in a you know, some sort of public role. And so we have been running post-election workshops with elected officials across New Zealand and Australia, and I think it's been really, really effective, giving them the tools to ask the right questions of their staff or their team, and get them thinking more than 1 year. You know, start saying, hey, well, if we defer this, there's going to be a lot of pain down the track. And look, what we found, and I'll talk about New Zealand. I won't make any commentary on elected officials in America, but we do elect some officials, elect some governance members in New Zealand who have platforms and have pre-agendas and won't listen and just want to do whatever they want to do. And people have opinions about them that might be less than favourable. So those people, though, what we've found is generally when you provide them with a good workshop and some good training, and maybe there's 2 or 3, and that's part of a program of training of them in their role as elected official, that almost all of them come on board and they can see the value of it, because deep down most people are actually there to serve their communities. And so we've had a lot of success with that. At the end of the day, you do need to engage with your elected officials. That is the bottom line. That's our system of government across the Western world, and long may we continue with that. And so, as professionals in the field, we've got to be able to present information in a way that they can make good decisions, but also not hide the risks if they make poor decisions. So, if they make a decision that increases risk, or is going to increase cost, or is going to create a lot of long-term problems, they need to know about that and be really aware of it and own the problem. Don't hide it from them.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways that I've observed that you get asset management thinking embedded is by celebrating your successes. We're not very good at that as an industry. We don't really do a good job of explaining this is something we did using asset management thinking or asset management principles, and here it saved us time or money or efforts or prevented a problem or whatever it might be. And when people can see the direct result, I changed the way I did things and now this is better, they get so bought in and it never goes away. Those people that understand the value don't drop back down. It's the ones who don't see the value that will drop back down. And there are some people that, you know, that one victory alone has sold them for life because they know it worked and it changed the way that they were doing things. So don't forget to celebrate what worked and what was successful, because that starts to get people realizing, oh yeah, we did it this way before, we do it this way now, or we made this different decision and it either prevented a big problem, or we cut down the brakes, or we get better customer service, or, you know, whatever it might be, save some money, you know, whatever the thing is, or even it made the operator's job easier so that he had more time to do maintenance. So whatever the thing is, celebrate those successes and make sure you document them so that in people's minds they understand the direct result of asset management, and it helps them realize that it's a good thing to do and a good thing to keep doing.
Yeah, and look, I mean, one of the problems that you have with asset management, we often get, people say, hey, you guys in Australia and New Zealand, you've been doing this for, a decade and a half, nearly 2 decades now. What are the savings? And, we want to reduce it to a fiscal saving, and it's a really hard question. And I'll give you an example. I've been over here for about a week, and I've heard about an authority where they had a steel pipe over a motorway bridge that let go, big pipe, wrecked the motorway, was it an interstate or just a local freeway? Wrecked half the freeway, closed the other half of it. Happened over a weekend, big drama, and at the end of the day, it all got fixed up, and they had to fix up the road. But the cost was huge, absolutely huge, and it would have been the cost of that incident would have been probably 4 or 5 times the cost if you'd done a planned replacement. And so what you've got to be able to do is say, hey, we've been managing our assets. We go and inspect our steel pipes that go over bridges on a say an annual basis. I would have thought would have been reasonable. We're on top of it. We noticed this one's had starting to get some pinhole leaks. So what we've done is we've moved the program around and we're doing a program replacement, and it's costing us X. That's good management. What you also need to point out to your governance and the people who are funding you is, hey, if we'd let that go, that would have cost 4 times that. And replacing big steel pipes is not a cheap exercise at the best of times. Multiply that by 4 and go, oh wow, so that's what asset management is about. Yeah, it's about committing a bit of thought up front and a bit of inspection and a bit of getting the program right. And so what your savings are, when you do it right, you don't, all you do is you're actually saving huge amounts of money, but because it hasn't gone wrong, people don't see that money saved. They just go, oh well, we're just getting on and changing, replacing stuff. It's really useful to know if you've had one of those incidences, and most people have. I had one years ago where we were cleaning an asbestos cement sewer pipe just before Easter, which was a stupid thing to do at the best of times. Blew, and it was just about wrecked, and through a major intersection, and the thing collapsed. And it was in our biggest industrial area. They had massive industrial flows, and luckily they were all closing down for Easter. With New Zealand, we get a lot Friday and Monday off, but we had crews out there all that weekend, double time, fixing a pipe under emergency repair. And it was like 150 metres of it died, and it was, I think it was 12-inch, and we took it up to, we said, oh, we've been under capacity here, let's try and take it up to, I think we went up about 4 inches in capacity, up to maybe 16 or 15, might have been 15-inch. And that was fine, and I got on Sunday, Easter Sunday, I got this phone call from the contractor who says, hey Ross, you better come out to the site. And right in the middle of this intersection, there was a big 12-inch water main going across the sewer main with a massive big valve set. And where the sewer main was, they poured a whole heap of concrete thrust blocks for the valves and the changes in the water main. And guess what? It was 12-inch hole, and we were trying to thread a 16 or 15-inch pipe through it, and A didn't go through B. They said, what do you want us to do? Do you want us to knock this out? I said, no, I don't think so. I don't think we're going to be starting to play with thrust block concrete on Easter Sunday when we've got the major water pipe here as well. So we had to design on site on the day a throttle and build it. And what a mess, If we'd been able to do that job well and not in that circumstance, we'd have done it for about 1/3 of the price probably, and a much better result. That throttle's still there, it's just a pain, and there was just nothing we could do about it. And the guys that were doing the work, they were good. We had to organise crews, but by golly, it cost us some money. So everybody has one of those stories, and they're the ones that you need to tell your governments about. Say, look, this is what we're saving. If we do our asset management properly, we don't get those anymore, and they save you a heap of money and a heap of aggravation. They always happen at the worst possible time too.
Dawn, I just want to do a check-in and see if we had any more questions come in. Oops.
Yes, we do.
Okay.
With the water infrastructure?
Before you ask that question, I just wanted to let everybody know that there's a couple of resources up on the screen. A couple are Ross Waugh's websites and information sites, just so you have them, and we'll try to send these links around as well, but I just wanted to let you know that those are up there. So go ahead, Dawn.
With the water infrastructure in America crumbling, why do you think asset management has not been regulated like New Zealand?
I don't know that much about American politics. Well, what I do know is New Zealand regulated quite early, and it's been a good thing. Australia tried to do it voluntarily for a very long time, and a lot of these states are regulating now. What you simply realise, I think people try to do things voluntary and say, hey, this is a good idea. And what you do is you get the top 20%. And they were going to do it anyway. What I was here in New Mexico, they've got a funding agency, and they're actually making their funding conditional on asset management. I think that's maybe the way it's going to happen in America, where the funding agencies will actually say, hey, if you want the co-funding, then you're going to have to demonstrate that you've got decent asset management in place, so that we know that we are co-funding the right assets in the right work program. And I think the other thing is maybe authorities that are raising bonds. I think if you had good asset management, you could probably go to your bond rating agency and make a case that you're managing very, very well, and that might affect your bond rating. You're a country that doesn't take to people forcing you to do things very well. There's some fairly strong historical precedent there, so I think that might be the reason.
Yeah, I don't think we take kindly to people telling us what to do. I also think perhaps part of the problem is the people, again, the decision makers would be, Congress, for example. It would take probably something in Congress or something written in either the Safe Drinking Water Act or Clean Water Act to actually make it mandatory. And I don't know for sure if all of those folks really understand the benefits that the United States could achieve from doing asset management, and so it wouldn't appear to them to be a good thing to do if they don't really understand fully the benefits. So, I'm kind of more of the opinion, if we could even get the top 20 or 25% and maybe even push it down to 50% voluntarily, if we could start having a bunch of stories to tell that, hey, this isn't being done because an outsider says it's best, and by outsider I mean a regulatory agency or a state or federal agency saying you have to do this. We're doing this because it's best for us as the water and wastewater systems that are doing it, and we're doing it because we achieve the benefits ourselves. And I think if we could get enough good stories to tell, maybe down the road they may have to mandate it to get the other 50% or 60% that won't do it without a mandate. But hopefully we can get maybe some better, more examples, and people really seeing the value in the voluntary world, and then maybe someday there would be a mandate. My only caution on the mandate side is I always caution, or fear, I guess is the right word, that the mandate won't be done properly. New Zealand has been, at least initially, was pretty open to, we want sort of financial efficiency, and left kind of a lot of there was a lot of flexibility for an agency of how they did it, and we would not want somebody to say, you must use program X, you must fill out form Y, you must fill out form Z. I mean, I don't think we want to go down that path where it's really prescriptive of exactly what you have to do. I think we want it to be a little bit more flexible than that.
Yeah, and I think the thing you've got to realise, and I guess this might be the case for the US now, New Zealand started its mandatory asset management off the back of a savage recession, which would be our worst one since the Great Depression, which was at the end of the 1980s. And so we ran out of money. We had 65% of GDP was government debt, and we just didn't have money to waste. And so that pushes you to manage better and to do things smarter. And so that was what was sitting in behind it. And you had basically the act that went through, or the legislation that went through to say asset management, that just went through. It was a bipartisan exercise. There was no dispute about the fact it was needed. And so I think, you go back a decade or so ago, America wasn't in that situation. I think maybe off the back of this recession that you've had, that people are thinking more about the need to work as efficiently as possible and to get some long-term sustainability. So I think maybe you'll see some stuff as a result of just the general awareness that there's not a whole heap of money floating around. So.
Okay, we're coming close to the end. I don't know if you have any last quick questions, Don?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. I was talking to nobody. I apologize. That is the end of my question list.
Okay. I just wanted to take a couple of moments because we are getting to the end of our time, and I just really want to thank Ross for being willing to do this. I will say that Ross volunteered his time today. We have been colleagues for a number of years now, and I really enjoy speaking to Ross, and from Asset Management Geek to Asset Management Geek, we have some really lively discussions about what's going on over here, what's going on over there, and I thoroughly enjoy having those discussions with Ross, and really love, getting to hear what's going on elsewhere and bring some of their experiences. It's nice to learn from what people do elsewhere so that you don't have to repeat the same mistakes and can kind of build on what works. And I really wanted to, be able to share this opportunity to talk to Ross with all of you, and I appreciate all of you signing on and sending in your questions and spending this time with us, and I totally appreciate Ross being willing to share his experience and the wealth of knowledge that he has with all of us. So hopefully, maybe in the future we can reroute him here again and have another go at one of these webinars, because I think it's a lot of fun to kind of share experiences, and that's kind of how we learn about asset management, is we learn from each other. You can't really be in a vacuum trying to do this. You really need to talk to others who are doing it, and what worked for you, and how did you think through this. We had a recent meeting in South Dakota where we talked through one of the water utilities had an issue with air release valves, and we talked through that issue as a group, and we had several people in the room who had different perspectives, and we could talk through, hey, did you think about this? Did you think about that? And I know the learning was much better because we had that group of people with different perspectives. So, it's really nice to have these kinds of opportunities to share different ways of thinking and, really work together, because I think that's the way we'll get it done.
It's been a real pleasure being part of your webinar today, and I love asset management. It really just becomes a way of life for you, and just seeing authorities making good steps and serving their communities better and getting their everything lined up for a long-term sustainable solution just pushes a lot of my buttons, and I get a lot of enjoyment out of that. So it's been really nice being with you people today, and hopefully that you've got something out of it. So
I have one last-minute question that it will take a very brief answer, so I'm going to go ahead and throw it out there.
Okay.
What is the minimum size of water system asset management is useful for?
I'd say one person. In my opinion, there is no size that is too small, because I actually use asset management thinking for my household. I use it for my car. I use it because it's so embedded in me, I almost can't think without it. So I don't actually think there is a level too small. Now maybe Ross has
I agree with
opinion,
that. I agree with that. Yeah.
But I think you can do it, just everyday thinking. Most of us have personal budgets that are not never ending. We have a finite amount of money, and if you choose to buy a car, what does that mean you can't buy? Or if you choose to fix your house up or move or something, how does that impact other things in your life? So it's no different than like a very, very small water utility has to make those same decisions. If I choose to do more replacement of this, I can't do some of that. So it's just really decision making and thought processes. So I don't think there is a level at which it's too low to do this.
Yeah, just keep it at the right scale, and you don't need a 500-page document if you've got a 10-household water utility.
Yeah, and you don't need a $10 million program either. If you've got 5 assets, a piece of paper might do it, or an Excel spreadsheet, or as long as you lower down your sophistication level, anybody, any size system can do it. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find anybody that would not benefit at any level. All right, thank you all so much again for being with us. We really appreciate you signing on. And we'll just send you out some links that have some of these resources so that you could take a look at what Ross has. He's got some really good stuff up there on his different websites. So take advantage of that, and then we'll give you the link again to the resources like the AM Can Work guide that we have. So we'll make sure you get that link so that you can take a look at that if you would like. And then I'll also include a link to the Asset Infrastructure International Infrastructure Asset Management Manual. It is purchased through Australia. I don't know if you can purchase it through New Zealand as well, but it's
mainly Australia now.
but I'll give you the link. It's not a cheap purchase, but if anybody is interested in that, we'll just provide the link, and you can go online and make a purchase of that manual.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'm planning to do, Heather, over the next 12 months is to put a series of teaching up on InfoManage.com about that as well, just taking people through each section. So keep an eye on that website if you're interested in that, and there'll be some video training and stuff up there for that. So
great. All right, well, thank you, everybody, and I think this will conclude our webinar.